computer. Now, I think we should be going. Okay. Good morning.
Good.
Welcome to Talking Smart, Conversations with colleagues and educators, colleagues in education and philosophy from around the world. I'm your host, Richard Mort, Morehouse. Today's guest is Professor Wendy Turgeon. Professor Turgeon specializes in philosophy of children and history of philosophy. Wendy is presently chairman of the Department of Philosophy at St. Joseph's University in New York, where she's been teaching courses since 1991. Professor Turgeon received her BA in philosophy from Southern Illinois University in Edwardsville, which coincidentally is the home of the John Dewey Collection. I thought that was an important little thing to add. That wasn't in the original piece, but I thought it was anyway. And then she did her MA and her PhD at St. Louis University. One of the leading proponents, she's one of the leading proponents of the Freshman's Honor Program at St. Joseph's University. And she, in addition to coordinating the program, she teaches one of the core courses. She has also incorporated global education into her philosophy classes at the university and is a passionate advocate for study abroad. Dr. Turgeon is also instrumental in creating the university's minor in women's studies. Dr. Turgeon has presented papers and workshops and conferences around the world and has published several articles in magazines such as Philosophy Now and International Journal of the Humanities. Her publications focus on philosophy of children and bringing philosophy into pre-college education. Among her books, Philosophy in Schools, An Introduction to Philosophy and Teachers, Philosophy and Education from Cambridge College Publications. She is a member of the American Philosophical Association, or North American Community of Inquiry, International Council on Philosophical Inquiry with Children, and Philosophical Learning and Teaching Organization, Plato. Wendy's scholarship and professional interest include philosophy of childhood, ethics, aesthetics, and medieval philosophy. And then I have a bunch of articles listed, and you can add to or subtract to that later. So I thought we might talk about a couple of things today. One thing that I talked about a little bit with Professor Lone was her involvement with the ethical bowl. And I've been fascinated by that since I first read the book. So you want to talk a little about your involvement with the Ethics Bowl?
Sure. My involvement has been with the high school Ethics Bowl, and I've been a judge pretty much continuously. I think I missed 1 year since we started about 11 or 12 years ago here on Long Island. It was a regional bowl, and Roberta Israeloff really was one of the main architects of our program here, and she collected some judges there. It's really pretty fascinating. High school students are given a set of cases that have been created different ways, although currently there is a committee of students, graduate students, professors that write the cases, and they're usually based on some relatively contemporary article or issue. And so they're presented with the cases ahead of time, and their coach at their high school helps them work through to think about how do they want to think about the cases. Now, the interesting thing about the Ethics Bowl is it's not a debate. It's not the win-lose in the sense that you take one side, we take the other side, and we kind of fight it out. It is ideally a conversation. And over the years, I've watched the high school students get better and better at it as their coaches get better at this. And it becomes a kind of conversation on how can we think about a particular issue. And it's very scripted in terms of how much time each team has to present. And yes, there are winners. I don't like to say they're losers, but there are people that score, groups that score higher.
Sure.
And throughout the day, it happens all in one day. The higher scoring groups move on to the second round, to the finalist round. The last number of years I've been serving as a judge on the finalist round, and it is such an exciting event. First, these students are phenomenal. For those that might get a little discouraged at young people's interest in things, boy, this blows it out of the water. They are articulate, they're passionate about these issues, and they'll present the cases. And if the other team presents the same side, that's okay. But they might say, oh, well, what about this angle? Or did you think about this? Or how would you handle this objection? So it goes back and forth like that. And I think at the end of the day, although there are winners that then go on to the regional high school ethics bowl and ultimately the national high school ethics bowl, I think everyone, sounds a cliche, walks away a winner if they had the courage to participate.
Sure.
I can't imagine I'd have that courage when I was in high school, but boy, these kids are phenomenal. And it gives them an opportunity to think clearly and consistently and practice this before they walk in the room. But they never know what case they're going to be given in any particular round.
Okay. Well, one of the things that fascinated me, if I understand this correctly, is that one of the way you get points is by helping the opposition understand their position more clearly. Is that a fair way to characterize that?
It's not a bad way. There isn't actually a category that says that, but the point is not to decimate the enemy. The point is to collectively in community think better about an issue. And if a other team presents something that seems a little garbled or seems to have some problems, the responding team's job is to point those out, but to point it out in a caring way and in a careful way. So they'll often, I mean, it's scripted, but they'll say, thank you for your contributions. Have you thought about this? And everyone is very cordial, unlike real world politics.
Yes.
Everyone is very cordial. And I've seen that develop over time, and I don't think it's just an act. I think over time it becomes, they really do focus on the topic, not focus on, can we prove the other guy's wrong?
Right.
So I think, well, again, that's not a specific category. That certainly is part of the spirit of the ethics bowl.
Yeah. Okay. How would you compare a good college bowl discussion with a philosophy for children discussion, a good one?
Great question. And ideally, I'm finding a lot of the techniques that we're seeing in the ethics bowl has borrowed from, maybe not consciously, but borrowed from the idea of a community of inquiry, and trying to build that sense of admitting one's errors, acknowledging fallibility, but focusing not on personality, not on winners, losers, but on better understanding a topic. And of course, at the end of these sessions, it's not like they've solved the problem and everyone agrees and, oh yes, this is, but they've at least uncovered maybe some, as I like to say, bad answers. And I think a community of inquiry in philosophy of children has to have a sense of movement. There has to be a sense at the end, if I'm more confused, I have to somehow figure out that's a good thing. And if we've eliminated some maybe not so great answers, maybe some bad answers, that's a good thing. Even if we haven't come to consensus, it's not a democracy where we vote on it. None of that should be part of a philosophy of inquiry community in P4C, and maybe even in the ethics bowl.
Yeah. And probably, if I'm characterizing this correctly, there's a sense of working towards tentative conclusions. That's
the idea is you want to, yes, you do. You want to get to a better understanding of it. And, they will take aside that this particular action, cloning is wrong. And here is why it's wrong. So it's not like they don't take a position. They do. But in taking it's wrong, they also want to take into account what might those who say it's good, what would their response be? How would we respond to it? So there was a very conscious attempt to both present a position, but also anticipate and respond to counter positions.
Yeah, I just thought about this, but is there a sense that Tolman's nature of an argument kind of fits in that, the various kind of elements of making sure you have a premise statement and that you have to fully sort of consider the alternate position that as
I
a
think
way
that's
to,
absolutely fair. Yeah, I
yeah,
don't know if it's presented as such. I'm
yeah,
not sure how well versed in logic they are, but the better groups are very sensitive to those precise points.
yeah. Well, one of the things that I've been interested in for a long time, almost since I started working at all in philosophy for children, um, is the idea that philosophy for children is connected and sort of pushes forward ideas of what I would call progressive pedagogies. And my sense is that as philosophy for children has grown and expanded, it has become both a place where we learn from other progressive pedagogies and also teach other progressive pedagogies. Does that idea make sense? I mean, I guess I keep looking for connections and I think I see them.
Mhm. I'm sure you're right. Certainly when Lippmann and Margaret Sharp first developed this, this was clearly in the camp of what we label progressive education. The label makes me a little nervous just
Well,
because I think it's its own bird. You know, there are elements that I think I would probably be described as conservative. I mean, I think you have to know something. You can't just talk about it. You have
right.
to have information. You have to have some background knowledge. And I think that's critical, but I think both in philosophy, but also in whatever the topic is. So if I'm talking about cloning and I know nothing about the science behind it, um, my argument's going to be specious. It's not going to be functional. So the conservative movement in education kind of stresses body of knowledge, acquiring information. And I don't think that that's a bad way to go. What becomes a bad way is if it's just something, perhaps like many of my experiences in school, where I could memorize for a test, do really well, and then it would be out of my head the next day. But at the same time, I'm kind of partial to E.D. Hirsch Jr. and his approach to learning. But couple that with the kind of methodology and engagement, the more democratic, progressive approach to education that says it's not top down, it's not teacher knows everything, students know nothing. They're not sponges. They're not just there they are there to interact and contribute. And the learning goes both ways. And that is definitely borrowed from progressivism. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's interesting. I guess I don't like that idea of conservative and liberal or whatever progressive in terms of because I think all education needs to be based on knowledge and it's agreed on set of facts and approaches that we need to take. But yeah, so yeah, they're all integrated. But well, I don't know. I guess my connection that I have sort of weaved through my understanding of all of these ideas kind of begins with a sense of, well, I guess I was sort of weaned on Jerry Bruner way back in the 1970s, and Bruner really made impact on me, everything from his earliest work on education to his latest stuff in terms of the idea of the role of story and whatnot in terms of understanding. And so I don't know, I see all those things connected and I keep trying to make a more definitive statement about that, but that's been what, 45, 50 years of trying to figure that out, and I still haven't done it. But but then that sort of leads me to the other thing that I want to talk about a little bit, and that's how all of these ideas fit into university teaching.
Yeah, yeah. Which
And
is what I do primarily. Yes.
yeah, yes. So how do you well let's take it be fairly specific. Um, how does philosophy for children ideas enter it in terms of course preparation?
Well, I try.
Yeah.
But I am inspired in many ways by what I have learned and written about in doing philosophy with children to take those techniques into my undergraduate classes. My students come to me very passive, most of them. They're generally bright kids, and they're nice kids. I say kids, that's probably, I don't mean that in a derogatory sense, but young people.
Yes.
But I think they've been failed by their education. They've been given good grades because teachers just don't want the hassle from parents, to be honest with you. That's my view. I may be wrong, but some will agree. And so they're good kids. They think they had a good education, but they don't know how to read for meaning. Their vocabulary is not great. Words that I think are relatively common words, not technical language. And they get discouraged really easy. If learning isn't fun and easy, they feel like, well, this isn't worth it. So I think undergraduate instructors, at least in my institution, and I can't speak for they're all different, borrowing techniques that get students to take ownership of their own learning, which is front and center in philosophy with children, acknowledging that they have these capacities, that they aren't just sitting there waiting to be, put stuff on paper and give it back to you. I think that's a really eye-opening experience for them. And I try to create a community, especially if my classes are a size where I feel I can do that. My classes are relatively small. I don't teach large lectures or anything. But at the same time, I want them to listen and talk to one another, become better listeners, become better thinkers and reflectors. And I borrow a lot of techniques from that. I'd love to say I'm super successful. I think that I don't think I can say that. I try. And I hope that at least some of the students come out thinking like, oh, I actually was able to do that. Or I thought philosophy was boring, but actually I've been thinking those questions all along. And so, I borrow a lot of techniques I've learned a lot by attending the American Association of Philosophy Teachers conferences. Those are amazing if you want to focus on pedagogy. And I find a lot of them are, without necessarily realizing it, echoing the same sorts of techniques and methodologies that we find in the traditional P4C literature.
Well,
sorry for my long-winded answers. You
no,
can
that's
shut me down anytime.
No, we've got a lot of time, but I think that one of the things that I try to tell students and try to practice and remember, I guess, really the key is to remember, because sometimes I get frustrated too and say, well, why don't the students know that? Why didn't they come prepared with that? And then I say to myself, oh, was I prepared when I started college? Not by a long shot, not by a long shot. They were, and I was so ignorant about so many things, and I have to keep that in mind and how to bring people on. And also, and I'm probably talking too much here, but I think the challenge for me is always to work towards convincing students that working hard and having fun in terms of academic ideas are not contradictory, that they are actually one and the same. And if they get involved in that, and if they start really grappling with ideas, I think they can often see the joy in that, and if not fun, joy in that kind of learning. So
They have a precedent for that.
Yeah, any
Yeah.
of your thoughts on that idea about how we work at instilling that sort of challenge to bring students to the table to get excited that way?
Well, one thing to think about is that if they're athletes or dancers or musicians, they know, they've experienced that hard work. I mean, it's not fun practicing, but it pays off. And the excitement and the thrill of doing a good job on the field or in the band or on the stage is incredibly rewarding. The challenge is to kind of translate that experience, which many of them are very familiar with, to sitting in a classroom tackling a subject that they probably never had before, seems very daunting, and doesn't seem to have back of the book answers that they're
Yeah.
used to. So getting them to be kind of to rediscover, as I like to say, their inner 4-year-old. And when you were questioning everything, where you were totally fine with ambiguity, it's sort of an adventure for them. And it's difficult because they're adults now, right? They don't want to be kids. Kids are very anxious to grow up, which itself is an interesting topic. But I think if you can get students to be puzzled by things, then they're engaged and they will work on puzzles. But it's an art. It's not, you can't read a book and just do it.
No.
Goodness knows. And I have some colleagues who are phenomenally good at it. I think they're gifted teachers. I'm not one of them. I work really hard to do what best I can. But I do know some of my colleagues who are just amazing. And they have that, they can draw them out. And I think it's wonderful. And we all try. We care. We do care.
Well, I think that it's, well, I just think of an example. I remember teaching a couple of summers at Texas Wesleyan with Ron Reed. And I've always found Ron to be just very easy and flowing with the ability to ask those kind of questions and get students involved. And then I watched him prepare. Well, he worked his tail off to be so casual in class. And I think sometimes I know that happens to me. I look at those gifted teachers and I think, oh my God, how do they do that? And then I think, not realizing how much work they put into that casual presentation as well.
Good point.
So
Yeah.
I'm just saying that that's something I need to be reminded of regularly because it helps put me in a different place and enjoy my preparation.
Yeah, it's not just a gift that they have and I don't. There's a lot of hard work on their part as well.
Yeah. So anyway, what else? Yeah, okay, medieval history. That's one of your areas. Let's take a look at medieval history a little bit to see. That seems to me to be potentially a daunting topic for undergraduate students. Talk a little bit about engaging people in the thrill of medieval history.
Well, in fact, I'm teaching it coming up in a couple weeks. I don't offer it every semester or every year even, but it's on my agenda again, and I'm kind of very excited about it. I've done it in a couple different ways. One way I did it was to have them read the complete, or most of the Confessions by Augustine, The Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius, some other short, complete pieces, and kind of really get into the personalities and the themes that emerge in those. However, this semester, I'm going back to my collected book of readings because there's so many fascinating topics that come up in medieval philosophy. Questions of freedom, questions of evil. Students do sometimes get a little bored with the God talk because they're thinking like, I'm not religious. What do I, all they do is talk about God. So I've already been thinking, well, you have to present it as this is not a theology course. It's not a catechism course, goodness knows, but that these individuals were seeking truth and they were seeking understanding. They were seeking beauty. And the language that they had to do that was God. And what did that mean to them? And what I find fascinating is too many students come to me with zero knowledge of religion.
Oh, yes.
So I kind of start by just kind of giving them some bit background so that the names, who was Moses, who was Joseph, that they're at least have a kind of vocabulary, if you will, of ideas. And we don't spend a lot of time on that. We look at some of the early church fathers, and then we go and some of my most favorite ones are people like Pseudo Dionysius, John Scotus Erigena, amazing. Trying to think, Peter Abelard, fascinating person,
Yes.
character. His story is always riveting for people. But he also was this kind of arch rationalist that was convinced human beings could answer questions. And I like to point out that we wouldn't be sitting where we are today with electricity, with, air conditioning, with all of the technology we have if these early philosophers hadn't thought it's possible to understand the world.
Mm-hmm.
And that there was a big divide in early medieval philosophy, whether those who, all you need is faith, or do you need some understanding too? And thank goodness the understanding won out. Philosophy was not anathema, although there were a group that wanted it to be. And when you see the word philosophy, it's natural science, it's general knowledge. It's not just studying dead white guys or whatever. So I try my best to kind of connect the thoughts. Do we care about free will today? Is it still an issue? Well, it certainly is. What about, is there a God? And, if I can describe him, am I, him, it, she, whatever, do I have absolutely no understanding whatsoever? And why would it matter? How is the world a different place if there's an order and meaning to it? Maybe there isn't, but so those are the kind of questions that I like them to try to get engaged with, or even just how do words mean? Oh, this is the problem of universals. What do general words point to? And when you say cat, is there there's cats, but what do those words do, and what do they mean, and are they real? Are they just names? Are they just empty? That's all fascinating medieval. I'm sorry, I'm kind of not giving you a mini course in medieval philosophy. I'll stop. But I think these are things that students can get excited in. And medieval history in general is something usually you jump over it in a couple days. It's not considered, it's the Dark Ages. Nothing happened, right?
Yes.
From the case.
Yeah.
Fascinating stuff happened then.
Well,
so I really enjoy teaching it, I guess.
yeah.
And I like introducing them to it. And, again, sometimes I'm very successful. I encourage history majors. I like history majors to take the course because it will complement what they're doing in their straight history classes, and literature. So one of my projects, I also have a whole section on medieval music and how medieval music, which I am a passionate fan of, how that mirrors in many ways the structures of philosophical arguments. So I try to give them opportunities to kind of explore the medieval philosophy through the lenses of other disciplines, if that helps them connect.
Yeah. Well, two things. One is take me to school about medieval music, because I'm almost totally ignorant about it, except for Gregorian chants.
Yeah, that's the other. But yeah, it's a fascinating period of music. And when you get to the first polyphony in the 12th century, it's just how they develop the idea of more than one voice, parallel voices. Then you get this kind of thing called a motet. And I promise I won't go on too long, where it's three different voices, usually three. And the bottom is always a quote from a plain song. So something from the liturgical text. The other two voices can be in the vernacular or in Latin, or sometimes in both, and they only have to agree with the bass. They don't have to agree with one another. So you get these really intricate harmonies.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would highly recommend listening to Guillaume de Machaut, who wrote in the early 1300s. Now he's relatively late, but he's a kind of a fascinating composer that is just, his music is astonishing. And I had no clue about it. I took a music history course, and my music professor just introduced this to me, and I fell in love with it in college. And so I've continued with it. And I just like to introduce students to it again, because that's something you're not going to get in a music history class. I mean, maybe you'll get the plain song, but then usually they get right to the Renaissance or Baroque.
Yeah, and then all of those connections. And one of the things I every once in a while just look at, there's a couple of books that are out that show a particular year, and then they do the philosophy, the science, the literature, the music. And every time I look at one of those pages, I get blown away. Because I can't keep in my mind that any particular day was so complex, that it had stuff going on in all of these areas, and that I knew someplace in the back of my head, but not often enough brought to the fore so that I really had a kind of a sense of awe about that period of time. It continually fascinates me. I just think, and I don't think we get enough of that. I
I
mean,
agree. I agree. I mean, if you read about the plague and you see the parallels between people today after the pandemic, and thank God we now have antibiotics, and we have, even antivirals. But the confusion, the way people interacted or didn't interact, that's just, there's so many lessons to be learned. It's kind of like reading the the it went right out of my head now, the dialogues, the Malaysian dialogue. I'm not getting the name right. It's just, I'm thinking off the top of my head, and
that's all right. That's all right.
a mistake. You read about the debate between the Athenians and this little island, and everything they say sounds like contemporary history. And that's that's the Peloponnesian War time.
Yeah, yeah.
Same is true in the Middle Ages. And, I think both children and adults can get excited when they see connections. And children, by the way, love ancient stuff. It is a fallacy that we should always teach with what they're familiar with. If they can name every dinosaur, chances are the dinosaurs aren't in their backyard roaming around, but they're fascinated by weird stuff like that. One of my favorite educators is Kieran Egan. Are you familiar?
Yes.
I think he's brilliant. And I think, his take on young children's ability to think abstractly meshes really nicely with what we do in philosophy with children. And I think if we could just keep that going into the high school level and the college level, and many students have it. So I sound like I'm really down on all of them. But I know, they're not encouraged. Often they're not encouraged. They have to fight that. And I think that's the kind of thing that gets people excited, whether it's medieval music or it's history or whatever.
Well, I had the fortunate experience of being able to spend a little time with Kieran Egan in Montreal, and go to with him to one of the classes that some of his students were teaching in Montreal. I mean, in Vancouver, and it was just fascinating to see that whole process in operation. I think he's a very undervalued and pretty radical thinker.
Yeah, in some ways, he inspired me to look into the philosophical potential of fairy tales, because he uses them as an example of how 5-year-olds get immediately that, that Cinderella is about, beauty and ugliness, or good and evil. I mean, they get those big ideas. They're not just focusing on the pretty dress. And that's true for most fairy tales, deal with these primal issues of human concern. And kids zero in on that. And he writes about that so eloquently that I think that kind of stuck in the back of my mind when I decided to look at fairy tales and kind of develop some ideas in that direction.
Yeah, well, he is quite inspirational. He was that for me too. And there's a whole controversy about whether that's in agreement or disagreement with Piaget, but it's neither. that's a whole complex area that is enriched by both of those thinkers. And they're, from
I
my
agree.
perspective, they're not contradictory. They're just different ways of looking at things. There may be
And
some contradictions, but
yeah, I'd like to also put it in a thing for Piaget. I think he's grossly misunderstood what he's claiming. And I think too many times he's been kind of turned into the sort of caricature of, well, you're in these stages and it goes like this. And that's not what he wrote at all. And, I think it's unfortunate that he's been completely marginalized, I guess, in a way, or else he's treated as if, same with Kohlberg, as if this is true,
yeah.
instead of as a way of thinking about and approaching these issues.
Yeah, well, this is neither here nor there, but I'll just throw this in. I just before Kohlberg died, he was at the third international conference at Thinking at Harvard, and I happened to be lucky enough to go to that one. And one of his great lines, he was talking about his students and how he interacted with students, and he said a student said, "Now, correct me if I'm wrong, Professor Kohlberg," he said, "but are you saying that you might be a level 5 thinker?" And the kid says, "And you can't even keep up your socks." And that was his way of kind of introducing himself. It was that image just sticks in my mind because he was a human and totally imperfect like the rest of us, and it was just wonderful to hear that expression. So, but anyway, that's neither here nor there. Anyway, and we're getting close to the hour. Anything that you'd really like to push? Anything about any new work you're doing, any research you're doing that would be fun to hear about?
Well, a couple things. First, I want to put a support in for Lippmann and Sharp's philosophical novels. A lot of people are dismissing them as old-fashioned, as out of touch. And I think though they are brilliant in their ability to incorporate serious philosophical questions into a storyline that could be updated, but it's there. And the stories are always open enough so that another thing I really like about it is that any child around the world can see themselves in these characters. I mean, I think that's important. And so I'd like to put a pitch in for those. That said, I think there's also a real advantage to expanding beyond this kind of curricular material to look at stories. And, I think Tom Wartenberg has done a phenomenally creative job at that. Years ago, I was teaching a grad course in philosophy with children, and all my students were teachers. And we used picture books in there, and a lot of them wrote, one of their paper options was to create a teacher's manual, kind of modeled off Lippmann's manuals for a children's story. And so I ended up with this amazing library of really thoughtful ways in which you could take a trade book, which is a cute story, and then see the philosophical implications behind it. And that's easier said than done. So these manuals and the opportunity for students to do this was very helpful. And Tom Wartenberg has done that and published books about it. So I think, he's out there, and I have deep respect for him. He's a good philosopher, and I think he's also really got his finger on the pulse of children's literature and how it has incredible potential. My own little area that I've focused on in recent years is that of fairy tales. And in my own book, Philosophical Adventures in Fairy Tales, I ended up kind of taking some very popular stories, most of them familiar to people, and then creating, a la Lippmann, definitely inspired by Matthew Lippmann and crew, guide for how parents or teachers, or even adults for that matter, because all fairy tales were written for multi-generational people. They were not originally written for children. And if you read some of the originals, they're not for children at all. Now, they have to get completely transformed. And I like to encourage people to read, I hate to say original, but earlier versions rather than just say, oh, I saw the Disney movie.
Yes,
which
yes.
transforms them into something quite different. So, that was fun to do. And the book that just came out this month, which is I've just edited, happen to have one right here. You can't see it, but it's The Philosophical Power of Fairy Tales from Around the World. It's published by Palgrave Macmillan, and I'm just the editor, but the contributions are from people all over the world on fairy tales from Iran, from Korea, Native American stories, and they've done an amazing job in terms of exploring. And Jana Moore Lone has a great chapter in there on the golem. So I highly recommend that book for not just teachers of preschool philosophy, but literary teachers or anyone who really would like to kind of think differently about some pretty intriguing fairy tales. And there are a couple in there that are written by practitioners of philosophy with children, and they do a marvelous job of two in particular are Korean. And they take Korean fairy tales, which are mostly unfamiliar to, at least to me, and they help the reader understand the philosophical implications. There's one from Greece too that does a really good job with that. So I highly recommend that because there is support material out there. People don't have to reinvent the wheel. Now, creative thinking is always welcome, but I think sometimes it's helpful to start with a source that has been carefully crafted or reviewed or thought about, because, not everybody reads with a philosophical ear. And I think that takes some practice to develop. So using resources like that, I think are very helpful. They're helpful for me. And I think they'd be helpful for anyone who wants to have a philosophical conversation with their own children or with a library group or in their classrooms or with adults.
Okay. Hold up the book again, please.
Let's see if I can get I blurred my background. So if I unblur, I think it'll show. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. Okay, so, well, it's reversed, so that won't help.
Well,
But
that's all right. Yeah.
if you can read
Oh, yeah,
backwards.
no, it's not reversed on my screen.
Oh, good. Oh, I'm so
Yeah,
glad.
yeah. Oh, yeah, very nice.
Yeah, it's a great collection of essays by scholars from many different disciplines, not just philosophy. But it's a good resource, and it just was published, so it's hot off the press, if you will.
All right. Well, I'll have to see if I can get a copy of that myself. So, well, I think this has been a wonderful conversation. And I hope it was as enjoyable
loved
for me
it.
as it was for you. So, and then I will see if I can stop recording, and then we will see if then we can chat for a moment. Okay.